Hello everyone, nice to see you. Thank you for joining me. With this series of videos, I'm thinking that I'd like to create a library, if you will, of the rules of thumb that are provided for you in Appendix B of your textbook. So what I'm getting at is that I'd like to provide a series of videos for you. This is the first one, and more are going to be linked for you in the description below of this video on YouTube, where you're going to get to see how to use the rules of thumb that are provided for you in Appendix B. So that's how to approximate the initial depth for steel girders, beams, and joists, for reinforced concrete girders, beams, slabs, even including drop panels, and even for precast, pre-stressed concrete elements. So the idea is that you'd have this library of videos available for you. They'd be linked for you also on our Brightspace page, and it would be an initial starting point for you to then learn how to approximate and select the initial depth or sizing of various structural elements. So without further ado, maybe let's get started. So the first element we're going to get started with is going to be the approximate depth, the initial approximate depth for steel girders, beams, and joists. So again, I'm in Appendix B of the latest edition of our textbook. That's the third edition of the textbook. And what we're looking at right now, say right here, is overall is coming up with this initial approximate depth of a W section. Now, if you're not sure what a W section is, if this sounds familiar, go check out our topic 2. This is covered also more there in our videos. But basically what this rule of thumb is, it provides a rule of thumb for calculating the initial depths for girders and for beams, basically coming up with that initial depth of their W sections. Let's start with girders first. And I just want to be super clear that the girders in this case are referring to these elements right here, the ones that span column to column. Okay, so just this one here, just so we're clear. They're primary structural elements because they support other beams. That is, if the girder were to collapse, other beams that are sitting on it would collapse as well. Now, the rule of thumb that's provided for girders is shown right here, okay? And the rule of thumb is span divided by 16. And the nice thing about this rule of thumb is that whichever unit you choose to use for the span is then going to be also the same unit you're going to be using for the answer you get. So let's start with some metric units just to do an example. Let's pretend that the span of the girder is 13 feet. And just so we're super clear, the span of the girder is this clear dimension from column to column, right? That's the length of the girder. So let's pretend that in our case, we're going to do our first example with metric units. Let's pretend that dimension is 13 feet, okay? And based on this rule of thumb, we take that span divided by 16 to get 0.8125 feet, right? Because the answer is going to have the same units as the span. Now, when using imperial units, you actually want to get that in inches because that's typically how it's done. So you multiply that by 12 to get 9.75 inches, okay? And then you're going to use the values that are provided for you in Appendix B to then find the closest depth of a W section. So I've reproduced them here, but you want to make sure that you can find them in Appendix B because they might look different in your Appendix B, okay? So I find the closest depth that is not smaller than this, and you'll notice that the closest one is right here, 10 inches. Okay, so that would be the size of a W section that you would select using imperial units. In Canada, though, we use metric units, so let's do a metric example as well. Let's pretend that the span for that girder is, in metric units, 7,346 millimeters. Okay, and then we're going to divide that by 16 according to this rule of thumb to get 459 0.125 millimeters. Now for these metric units, you usually round to the nearest millimeter up, right? You never round down in this case. So that would be 460 millimeters. And then what you would do is you would use that resource that's been provided for you in your working drawing class and also linked on our Brightspace page. The website is webcivil.com, and it's slash and other stuff as well. Okay, but it's linked for you on our Brightspace page, and it was also provided to you by your Working Drawings 4 professor. And when you go there, you can actually select from a list of W sections. Okay, you can find the geometry for it. Also look at topic 2 that we've covered in this course. And you'll see you're going to be selecting a member that's at least this depth, if not deeper, if you can't find any members that are that depth. Okay, so that's how you do it. You select a member that way. Okay, so let me clean things up, and when I come back, what we're going to do is we're going to repeat an example, but we're going to be using beams. So one moment. Terrific, we're back. So now what we're going to do is we're going to use the rule of thumb that's provided for you in determining the initial depth of a W section beam. And just so we're super clear, here's what I mean by a beam. Okay, it's those secondary elements, like all of these ones here, that span between girders. They're secondary structural elements because if a beam collapses, the rest of the structure is fine, right? It's only the immediate vicinity of that beam that will collapse with it too. And again, what we're going to be doing with this rule of thumb is learning of a way to come up with a preliminary depth of your W section. So the rule of thumb that's provided for us is right here, span divided by 22. You're even given the recommended spacing for beams, 8 to 12 feet, okay, that you can use as an initial rule of thumb. Great, so let's get started with this. Let's say the span, and again, that's the distance from girder to girder, right, your beam span. Let's say you have one, I'm going to make one in metric units, is 8,754 millimeters per metric units. I'm going to divide that by 22. And when I do that calculation, I get 397.909, again, millimeters, because remember, whatever units we use for the span are going to be the exact same units we then get as an answer. Okay? And then we approximate this, we round it up to the nearest millimeter, so 398 millimeters. Just like that. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go to Web Civil. Again, this is the resource that was provided to you by your Working Drawings professor. And it's also linked for us in our Brightspace page. Okay. And then you're going to select a member, a W section, that has a depth that is at least this, but no less than that, right? At least that or bigger as your initial depth. And that's it. Okay, that's as simple as it is. If these were imperial units, you'd do the same thing. Just make sure that you get the answer in inches, and then you'd go here on your Appendix B in your textbook to find the closest one that is larger. Okay? All right. So let's go on to the next example for steel structures. Let's do, in this case, open web steel joist. Okay, and just a reminder of what open web steel joists are. I know you can find that under our topic 2, but basically it's where you have a top chord, a bottom chord, and they're connected by a whole bunch of triangles, right? You'll see stuff like this, say in the roofs of Walmarts or Loblaws or similar big box stores. Okay, so what we're going to do in this example is we're first going to look at how to size girders, which is these ones here, okay, joist girders, and they're the ones that are primary structural elements because the girders support other open web steel joists. And then we'll also learn how to size the joists themselves, which are secondary structural elements because they span between girders. Okay, they support nothing else other than their immediate vicinity. But let's start with the girders first. So to be clear, I mean these elements here that span column to column. Okay, so we are going to be using a very similar format as we did previously. As it's given for you in Appendix B, the rule of thumb for girders is span divided by 14, like this. And just as we saw previously, whichever unit you're going to be using for the span is going to be the same unit that you're going to be obtaining for your answer, for the initial depth of that open web steel joist. So what you're looking at is this initial depth of your open web steel joist. So let's say that I've measured the span, so this distance right here, column to column, clear distance, as, I don't know, 13 feet again, just so we don't deviate. Based on the rule of thumb, you're going to divide that by 14. And when you do that ratio, you get 0.9286 feet, right? Because the same units as the span. But when it comes to sizes of members in imperial units, typically inches are used. So you have to multiply this by 12 to get an answer in inches, which is 11.14 inches, like this. And then what you're going to do is you're going to take this and then go look for the closest match based on the typical standard depths in inches of K-joist. Okay? But you want to find the one that's not smaller than that. So we have 11.14. The closest one that is not smaller than it is 12 inches. Okay? If we were doing this using metric units, so say millimeters, and I had a span that was, let's say, 7,346 millimeters, I divide that by 14 to get 524.714, again, millimeters, right? And then typically you round it up to the nearest millimeter. And then when it comes to this, then if you cannot find any valuable information on Web Civil, okay, webcivil.com, then you want to follow what I recommended in the lecture for topic 2, and that is go to the websites, the catalogs for the various suppliers in Canada of open web steel joist and see what they offer, right? Because they'll provide a catalog that will have depths of joist in millimeters, and you always want to pick a depth that is at least what you've calculated, but never less, okay? So it has to be more than 525, but never less than it. Make sense? Great. So let me clean this up a little bit, and when I come back, we'll do the joist. What we did now was the girders, right? Whoops, right here, the girders. And when I come back, then we'll move on and we'll do the joist instead, which is these ones right here. One moment and I'll clean things up. Terrific, welcome back. So what we're going to be looking at now is using the rules of thumb that are found in Appendix B of your textbook to estimate the initial depth of open web steel joists given their span. And what we're looking at is now the joists themselves. So I'm referring to all these elements that span from girder to girder. The rule of thumb you see here is you take the span and you divide it by 20. You're even provided with initial recommendations for spacings of joists. I just want to point out again, because this is an American textbook, the spacing for the roofs might underestimate the amount of snow that are on it, okay? Because that's more of a concern in Canada. So just be aware of that, please. Okay, so the rule of thumb, again, I'm going to reproduce it here, is going to be span divided by 20. And as we found previously, whichever units we use for span are going to be the same units that we had for our answer. Okay, and that again, we're trying to figure out an initial approximation for the depth, the vertical depth of our open web steel joist spanning between girders. So that means that in this case, the span that we're actually using is this distance girder to girder. Make sense? Lovely. So I'm going to just do a metric example because imperial is exactly the same as long as you make sure you get the answer in inches. So let's say that we have a span that is 8,754 millimeters. According to our rule of thumb, then we divide that by 20 so that our answer will also be in millimeters, and we get 437.7 millimeters. Good way to do this is to then round it up to the nearest millimeter. And then if Web Civil, the web resource, is not helpful with examples of geometry for open web steel joists, right? This is provided for you either on our web page for structures or in working drawings. You want to do what I recommend in our topic 2 lecture, which is go to the websites for the various suppliers in Canada of open web steel joist and see what they have to offer. You want to select the depth for an open web steel joist that's more than this. Okay, so again, let me make sure I write that down correctly. The depth that you select must be more than 438, right? Because this is the minimum that we obtained using this rule of thumb. So we don't want anything less than that. Okay, that's it. So more of the videos are going to be linked for you in the description below. I want to thank you so much for your time. Take care and have a lovely day.